Okay, one other thing. I came across an article that was recently this year in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I wanted to bring it up because I was mentioning ecstasy last time, and this is an article titled Low Doses of Ecstasy Associated with Decline in Verbal Memory. And I'll just describe a little because this study had a very good experimental design for testing something that's really difficult to do. They solved some problems. Here's what they said. Even low doses of ecstasy may be associated with a decline in language-related memory, according to a report in the June issues of one of the Journal of the American Medical Association journals. Ecstasy is an illicit recreational drug popular among young people. Blah, blah, blah. Here's what they did. The researchers recruited 188 volunteers, average age 22, who had not used ecstasy, but reported that they were likely to try it soon. Within 3 years of the initial evaluations, 58 individuals began using ecstasy. They were compared with 60 individuals who had the same age, sex, and intelligence score, but who did not use ecstasy during the follow-up period. All participants took tests that assess various types of memory, including attention, verbal memory for words and language, visual memory, blah, blah, blah. Verbal memory was tested by memorizing a series of 15 words and repeating them again immediately and 20 minutes later. At the initial examination, there were no statistically significant differences in any of the tests between the groups. However, at follow-up, change scores on immediate and delayed verbal recall were significantly lower in the group of ecstasy users compared with persistent ecstasy-naive subjects. Blah, blah, blah. The fact that main underlying factor seems to be depletion of serotonin. Serotonin is involved in several cognitive functions, but might be especially relevant to learning and memory. Anyway, I thought this was great because typically you would do a test. In the past, what people have done, they're like, well, we're going to measure the verbal performance of people who do ecstasy and people who don't. And the common complaint is, well, there's probably differences in those groups to start with. So they started with a group where no one had, tested them, saw that everyone was the same, and then afterwards they compared those who had done it and those who hadn't. So they didn't randomize people, which would have been slightly better to say, okay, you 90 people are now going to do ecstasy, you 90 people are not, but there are issues with doing that. But this was, the next best thing. They waited, but they already had the before measure, and then they were able to get the after measure, and they found out that we had this decrease in verbal memory. As I told you, learning seems to be decreased as well, which is disappointing for a drug that sounds pretty fun. But anyway, those are some of the results. Okay, today we're going to talk about industrial societies and culture. First, though, I want to finish up. Last time we talked about neurotransmitters and caffeine in particular. I wanted to talk just for a minute today, a couple of overheads, about alcohol, because it's similar to caffeine in that it has lots of effects based on mimicking neurotransmitters at the synapse. And I just wanted to show you that there are different ways you can do that. We saw that caffeine was mimicking adenosine, but we'll see that alcohol mimics a lot of other things. Oh, I should also mention, I really appreciate when you wrote down for me on Tuesday about what makes a lecture engaging versus not. It really helped my talk. I gave a talk on Thursday to a bunch of biology teachers, and I actually quoted from your responses that you gave to me, and it was very useful. Hopefully it'll help me. We'll see. All right, so let's talk about alcohol. It does affect animals as well. Here, that's not funny. That's mean. There we go. What alcohol does, and we say this in Mean Genes, we say it's a molecular everyman, because I want to contrast that with caffeine. Remember, caffeine goes in, and all it does is one thing. It takes the adenosine receptor site, and it fills it up. If something's already there, if adenosine's already there, it knocks it out, and it fills it up, and that's it. That's the only effect. Therefore, if I consume lots of caffeine before a lecture, I can still give lecture. I'll be a little bit wired, but nobody's going to fire me. On the other hand, alcohol, if I were to have a couple of drinks before I came to class, my ability to lecture would probably be impaired. Although I must admit, my first year here when I started, I was really, really nervous. I get stressed out before lecturing, and I really contemplated taking a shot of tequila or something before lecture, but I didn't. Anyway, you'll see from these effects that it has why I might think about doing that, but also why I might decide not to. The first is this. Alcohol reduces anxiety. How many of you are 21? Okay, so most of you have never drank before, so I'm going to describe to you some things that maybe your parents have experienced. The first is this. Alcohol reduces anxiety, and the way it does this, there is a neurotransmitter that's called GABA. You don't have to know what it stands for. It stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, but it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. In other words, when it docks into the receptor cells on the postsynaptic membrane site, the cell doesn't fire. So essentially, the release of GABA causes the cells in your brain to quiet down a little bit. Alcohol mimics GABA. Therefore, you have a greater effect of it. And the way it works is you would consume some alcohol, and most of the alcohol that you consume is going to either get broken down first in the stomach, but if it doesn't, it gets to the small intestines, it gets absorbed there. From there, it goes into your bloodstream, where it moves to your liver. In your liver, you've got 17 different forms of an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. And it does just what the name says, dehydrogenase. It rips off hydrogens off of it. Essentially, it dismantles it. It takes it apart. But there are, in one shot glass of alcohol, there are about 200 quintillion molecules of alcohol. Ethanol is the specific alcohol. Some of those slip by. They stay in the bloodstream. They move around. They get up to your brain. And because it's a really, really tiny molecule, it gets across the blood-brain barrier. It can squeak between cells and get into your brain. And that's where then it has these effects. So your body is working to break it down in the stomach or to break it down in the liver, but some of it slips by. The more you consume, the more that will slip by. The second thing that it does, produces stimulated, energized feelings. It does this through the dopamine system, which we talked about with cocaine. Dopamine, to put it mildly, makes us happy. And what alcohol does is to increase the dopamine levels in the synapse. It's not clear how it does this. There are a lot of drugs that people take that we know what their effects are, but we really don't know how they have the effect. We just know that they do. And so, in this case, unclear what's going on, but measures do show that there's an increase in the dopamine levels. So already we've got more going on than with caffeine. We've got this increase in the inhibition of some neurons, so they're not firing. We've got other happiness neurotransmitters being more effective, so you get a little bit happy. Alcohol blocks pain. The way it does this is through the endorphin system. Endorphins are molecules that are released from the pituitary in your brain, and what they do is they block messages of pain. Alcohol stimulates the release of endorphins, so you have more of them released. These are the chemicals that you may hear about when people run marathons. Over some period of time, these endorphins get released. They're responsible for runner's high. It just means that they stop feeling as much pain as they might initially. And the reason your body even has a system to stop producing pain, I talked about this when we first introduced nervous systems. Remember I said pain is a signal that tells you the environment is fairly inhospitable to you for one reason or another, so you have to take yourself out of that situation. At some point, you've gotten the message and you're trying to take evasive action. You don't need the signal continuing to come in to tell you that there's pain, 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 pain. And so the endorphins reduce that a little bit so you can try to be more effective in getting away from the pain. So alcohol is also going to stimulate the release of these endorphins. It's got a fourth effect. It decreases depression. We know that serotonin, remember serotonin affects anxiety, satiation, contentedness. We have our selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac. Alcohol increases the activity of serotonin by increasing the receptor activity. It's not clear exactly what it does. Oops, I sorted pictures here. It's not clear how it does this. It might be that it binds to the receptor so that it becomes a better fit with serotonin. It might be that it increases the number of receptors. Probably not. It might decrease the enzyme that breaks down serotonin. It's not clear, but more serotonin ends up in the synapse. And so there is, at least short term, a little bit of a reduction in depression. All of these sound pretty good, right? So far, you can think, hey, that might not be bad before lecture. You get here, though, to number 5, alcohol slows you down. There's a neurotransmitter, an excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate is important in learning. And what it does is it is causes the next neuron to be more likely to fire. Alcohol blocks the receptor. It sits in the receptor, and so now release of glutamate slows you down. So you're sending signals down, but the signal isn't getting from one neuron to the next. This is responsible for slow or slurred speech. It's responsible for reduced reaction times, and a lot of other things that are not desired effects generally. It's also been shown that the activity can be reduced by about 80% after 2 drinks, and you need the glutamate receptor for learning. And animals that have the glutamate receptor blocked have a real hard time learning things like how to run a maze. This is why if you're drinking a lot while you're trying to study, the effectiveness of the studying goes down significantly. Your body just isn't able to form the signals, send the signals that are associated with learning. So for all those, there are probably more. These are the 5 most common, though, and they all involve this mimicking of neurotransmitters. So this is what I would have said last time as the last take-home message. I think I told you that I had it, but I had forgotten the overhead. Here it is. So drugs, whether it's ecstasy or LSD or Prozac or alcohol, caffeine, can hijack pleasure pathways, tricking your brain into believing you're engaging in good and worthwhile behavior. All right, I want to move on now to today's primary topic, talking about living in an industrial environment. I want to start with a question, and it's this. I've talked about this a lot, but today I want to do it in a more organized, formal way. The idea that our environment is alien. And by alien, I mean we have evolved to be exquisitely adapted to an environment. Natural selection does that to organisms, but it hasn't adapted us to the environment we live in. So I want to think about the aspects of our environment that make it so different from the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. I abbreviate this EEA. EEA is a very important concept to keep in mind. Environment of evolutionary adaptedness says, what is the world to which the organism is adapted? In other words, you could catch a fish. You could go in Santa Monica Bay, go fishing. You could catch a shark. You could bring it home and you could throw it into your bathtub or you could throw it into your pool. It's not going to do very well there because it didn't evolve for that. It didn't evolve for fresh water. It didn't evolve for a tiny space. It didn't evolve for a space that has no food. So that's not the environment it has been adapted to. Same thing goes for humans. So the environment of evolutionary adaptedness would be the environment to which an organism is adapted. Frequently, that's the environment in which it's currently living. But in the case of humans, it's not. And I've told you this before, but for about the 2.5 million years that our species has existed, we were hunter-gatherers. We went out and killed live animals for food, or we collected nuts, berries, seeds, various plant parts, root parts, in order to get our food. That is a world. Over 2 million years, that's what we did. About anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, people debate this, but about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, people invented agriculture. They had the idea, hey, these plants we've been wandering around to find and collect the various things that they produce for us. Why don't we just plant the seeds, grow them right here? Then we don't have to keep moving around all the time. This was a very important adaptation in terms of changing the environment such that food became much more plentiful. It became much more predictable, but also it became much more stationary. People didn't have to move as much. And this is probably the most important thing in terms of altering the environment in which we live relative to the environment we evolved in first. So there's all sorts of different manifestations. Now, agriculture, you tend to think of agriculture as growing plants, but you can break up agriculture into horticulture, which is growing of plants, and pastoralism, which is the herding of animals. But it's the same thing. It's still considered agriculture if you decide you're going to keep a bunch of animals, reproduce them for your own benefit. And so let's think about now what has happened since then. Initially, you grow a little farm, and a lot of the societies that appear to be probably most similar to human populations when agriculture was first invented would be groups like the Yanomamo. We write about them in Mean Genes. They live in South America, and they grow plantains. They look sort of like bananas. You can do lots of things with them. You can fry them. You can boil them. You can put salty stuff on them. You can put sweet stuff on them. They grow relatively easily. And once you start growing them, you can have very big farms of them. That would be one thing you could do. There are other groups that have cattle. The Maasai in Eastern Africa do. We have a bunch of coconuts. People have cultivated those. You get all sorts of nutrients from them. Here's a guy growing flowers. Not a lot of nutritional value from them, but just demonstrating the ability to grow things in much greater numbers than previously you would have been able to do. We moved on, though, from agriculture relatively quickly in a few parts of the world into industrialized societies. Now, it's hard enough for natural selection to catch up when, for 2 million years, you're being adapted to life as a hunter-gatherer, and then, poof, all of a sudden you have agriculture. It takes a while for the adaptations to kick in. And then industrialization comes along, which changes it even more. Industrialization, we see things where there's been even a change in that. Here we have just some, various industrialized factories, power-producing plants, where we're creating power at one place, we're putting it somewhere else. This picture is really crazy because this is Venice Beach. It used to be covered with oil rigs not that long ago. Luckily, they've cleaned all those up. But oil wells, we find energy in one place and we use it somewhere else. But what I want to think about is this. How is it now, as an industrialized society, that we're even different from the societies that grew their own food or produced their own food? One of these is we don't have the capacity to produce our own food. You might produce some. You might grow some tomatoes or something like that. How many people here grew up on a farm? All right, so none of you, if you didn't have someone giving you your food or somewhere where you could get it, you probably don't have the capacity to do that. That is one important thing. We live in a world now where industrialized societies are characterized by a specialization of the production and then distribution of the resources to other places. But the question is, what else is different about our world? I think medicines. So, for instance, if you're diabetic, you certainly don't know how to produce insulin. Where are you going to get it? We depend on this. Various other drugs. I can't see which drug this is. But we rely on those, and we're not able to actually produce them. What are the other things about our world today that make it an alien environment, things that are part of the world, but you rely on other people in order to get them. How about just something simple like this? Shoes. Everybody here is wearing shoes. Do you know how to make shoes? No. I mean, you could probably make those shoes, but they're not going to do you much good for very long. Very, very difficult. Just things like this. We don't have the capacity because we have set up such a division of labor that we rely on other people. What else? What are some other things you don't have the capacity to produce? How many of you wear contact lenses or glasses? That's a lot of people. And so surely you don't know how to produce them or produce glasses. If I took them off, my ability to survive is pretty low. Like I would probably be dead before I got back to my office just from walking into a wall or being unable to find Ackerman to get some food. And it's kind of funny, but in a different world, or if all of a sudden the industrialization was taken away, I'm not surviving. But I am surviving here. What else is going on? What are some other aspects of industrialized societies that are different from the hunter-gatherers and from agricultural societies? Yeah. We can't make our own clothes as well. And you might say, oh, well, I can sew. But yeah, as long as you get fabric. Well, where do you get the fabric? And we've taken our society to a point where we're really good at a few very specific things. You know, you might be really good at video games. Or you might be really good at, I don't know, what are you good at? Cooking. Cooking as long as you can go buy the ingredients somewhere else, right? In the world we evolved in, you would be good at collecting food so that you could survive. You would be good at hunting. You would be good at building a house, which is another one, houses. So glasses as well. Contact lens is probably the next phase. You would be good at building a house. How many of you could build a house? Probably not just you, so you will do all right. Building a house is very tough. We don't have that capacity anymore. What else? Sanitation systems. Very, very tough. This actually was one of the big problems with the first agricultural societies. No one had ever figured out how to get rid of human waste because hunter-gatherer societies move at a regular rate. And so they would dig holes where they would leave their waste, and they would move around, and by the time they got back to an area again, it was already had been incorporated into the land, and it was okay. When suddenly you're staying in one area forever, it just builds up, and it gets really stinky, and it is a place where diseases thrive, and that's a real problem. So you have to figure out ways of getting rid of your waste. How do you do that? I don't know. I don't even want to know. Food, we said. Anyway, you could probably make a slightly larger list, but I don't think I have to make a larger list to convince you that our environment is alien, and it's very different from our EEA, the environment in which we evolved in. Now, why would I care that we live in a world to which we're not adapted? This is an important point. Why would I care about that? I would care because it says that my brain that has emotions, that has instincts, that has a lot of different features that were going to drive me to do the right behaviors and to survive in that environment, it's not going to help me anymore. Suddenly, my instincts are not going to be as reliable as they once were. But the important thing is that clearly we're doing well. Culture can help us thrive. We have a brain that's really adaptable. We have a brain that can figure out, aha, here is a novel situation, how can I solve it? And so I want to talk about what culture is. Now, when I say culture, I'm not talking about Shakespeare, or ballet, or the New York Times, or poetry. Those are certainly subsets of what culture is, but I mean something more general than that. I mean ideas that can change people's behavior, but don't have to be passed down from parent to offspring genetically. And I'm going to define it as this, as the transmission of information by extracellular means. That's kind of an off-putting definition, but the point of it is this. Your parents conveyed information in your body of how to produce eye color or how to produce alcohol dehydrogenase because genes were passed on. That's a cellular means of transmitting information. I'm talking about things that are not cellular. And when we pass things on through extracellular means, I would say this. I would say that culture can free us from biology. In other words, we can pass on ideas. We can pass on explanations for how to solve a problem. You didn't inherit a knowledge of how to produce shoes, but I'll bet any of you could learn how to produce shoes probably, over the course of a few weeks. So the idea that we've changed our society this quickly, we've changed it this quickly because of culture. The idea of agriculture is culture. It's an idea that passed on. Somebody figured it out. They told someone else how to do it. They told someone else. And pretty soon, everyone could do it very quickly. When you don't have to wait for parent to offspring, offspring to have their kids, you don't have to wait generation after generation, things can change very quickly. But because natural selection works one generation at a time, right? Variation for traits, they have to be heritable, differential reproductive success. You only go one generation at a time. Culture allows us to change things in the blink of an eye. You can very quickly acquire new skills. So because of this, it can free us from our biology. Okay, so we're not adapted to this world anymore, but we can learn how. So the ability of our brain to adapt is an important one in that our culture can free us from biology. I worry that it doesn't necessarily always do this. We'll talk about this. But there's a question you should be thinking about. This is true, but I want to know why. I want you to be able to describe why you could say that culture reduces the usefulness of our instincts. In the EEA, our instincts were good. They tended to get you to the right answer. Nowadays, as we point out in Mean Genes over and over again, you can't trust your instincts. Your instincts tell you, consume food at every opportunity. Your instincts tell you, don't save money because when you save for the future, the currency will rot. Your instincts can tell you all sorts of different things that are no longer useful. But this is unusual. For the first time, being unable to trust our instincts leads to all sorts of difficulties. I would say most of the self-control problems that you're ever going to encounter in your life stem from this fact that culture has changed our environment really quickly. Your brain and body are not adapted to the new environment. They have instincts inside of you that are guiding you to solutions, but those solutions are only appropriate for hunter-gatherers. And so, what are some of the instincts that we can't trust? This is really counterintuitive. Probably the most common self-help book strategy that you'll see is trust your instincts. Probably the most common thing you will see on daytime talk shows is trust your instincts. They're going to get you to the right answer. That sounds good, and people like to hear it because it's easy to trust your instincts. It says, just do what you want to do. If we were hunter-gatherers, that would be a good advice, but you're probably not watching that advice on a TV if you're a hunter-gatherer. So we've got this problem where, all right, we can't trust them. Am I saying that our instincts are always going to get you in trouble? No, it's even worse, because if your instincts were always wrong, that would be easy. It would be multiply your instincts times -1 and then trust them. They would tell you the right answer. The problem is this. In some areas, you can trust them and they give you the right outcome. In other areas, you can't, so you don't know. So, for instance, what do we have? Food. I don't know what that is on the left. Oh, I guess they're biscuits with gravy. Whoops. The food distribution system in our industrialized world can get us anything we want, anytime we want. In our EEA, food was in short supply and it was unpredictable. That is why, remember, fatties, fatties, and fatties again, we evolved to have instincts that said, when you have access to food, you should consume it. That is an instinct that for the hunter-gatherer and for almost all animals in the world, if they're evolving in their normal environment. An animal that's in the zoo is not in its EEA. If you are in your natural habitat, the instinct to consume as much as you can whenever you can is a good one. Nowadays, it's not, because you'll see food like this around being offered to you all the time. If you consume that, you're going to get a worse outcome. Question? EEA, Environment of Evolutionary Adaptedness. The first overhead. I'll put it back up, not the first one after alcohol. What is this? Environment of Evolutionary Adaptedness. So that's the world to which an organism is adapted. So if I talked about, remember I talked about Chontek, the fat orangutan in the Atlanta Zoo. Chontek is not in his EEA. He's in a zoo where they bring him food. His instinct as well got him a bad outcome. It caused him to get fat. Usually it's just humans, though, who are not in the EEA. Although we get some screwy results in laboratory studies that medical researchers will do because they are studying rodents that are living in the lab. That's not their EEA. And so same thing. You get all these problems where most lab rodents tend to be overweight. And so what happens is that we might be studying the effect of a drug on overweight individuals rather than normal individuals. We don't know. But the instincts of laboratory animals tend to get them into trouble as well. So the first thing is this. Our food distribution system can get us into trouble. Hunter-gatherers had to walk, on average, 10 to 12 miles per day. They had to carry everything they own because they would move a lot. For that reason, the energy expenditure and the fact that they had to look for the food, you don't see any overweight hunter-gatherers ever. And the instinct for high consumption is always going to be there. Here we have. So this is the problem now, is that you've got that hunter-gatherer brain and you've got Stan's Donuts in Westwood or Dee Reese, and that instinct can be problematic. We've also got this. Sorry, more fat. We've got our jealous guy here in the background. His girl's met a new guy. Whoops, sorry, I've lost my... We've invented birth control. This is an example of culture. Anything that you can think of as technology is culture. It is an idea that can be passed on to lots of people very quickly. So the invention of birth control, why would that be relevant to our EEA? Well, we've evolved sexual jealousy. When we detect a threat to the pair bond that we have, why is it? Well, risk of cuckoldry, risk of philandry, very high. Well, with birth control, she could have an affair with this guy here. Is that going to cause the other guy to raise his offspring with his money? Probably not. So he should be okay with it, right? Well, no, probably not. It gets complicated. However, the idea that we evolve sexual jealousy in a world where if she has sex with another guy, there is a significant risk of cuckoldry. In other words, this guy in the back, from a genetic evolutionary perspective, he's in big trouble. His resources are used to raise another offspring, the offspring of another individual, and that's very bad. So we've got instincts that are really strong at helping us to prevent that. So you have to think about why that might be. But also remember I had that other one, the overhead, where I said culture can free us from biology, but does it? Not necessarily. So think about why this may not be a complete turnaround that we're expecting. What else do we have? If you're a woman and you've got a kid, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you have to be with that kid 24/7. I'll go back to the hunter-gatherer we had earlier. Right here. She's got 2 of her kids with her. You have your kids with you all of the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, what about culture now has changed that? Does anyone in here have a kid? No one in here has a kid. Could you have a kid and still come to class? Yeah, you could. Where would your kid be? Daycare, exactly. And so that is an example of culture. We invent the idea of, hey, take your kid somewhere else, and your kid can be taken care of by other people, and you do not have to take care of them. So we can reduce the parental investment, or we can even shift some of it to the male, right? He can then go either pay for the daycare or pick up the kid, or any one of a number of different possibilities here. Was that my kid? That is. Oh, that's Jack and Julia. Okay, and here's another question. This is going to seem unrelated. It's very related. Why is it so hard to be a teenager? This was me in younger days. I was a punk on campus here. Here's a question for you. At what age did you become sexually mature? And by this I mean reproductively capable. I don't know the exact answer. What is it? It's about... It's different age in men and women. It's different age in different cultures based on nutrition, but an approximate ballpark. 13, 12. No, you're shaking your head no. Is it earlier? How much earlier? 11. It's funny you mentioned that age. My next door neighbor in Dykstra when I lived here, Bubba, who I still see. He works in the medical school now. I was at his house on Saturday night. He has an 11-year-old daughter. Now, I reminded him of something he told me when I first met him. He had sex for the first time when he was 11. Do not tell him that I said that. He'll kill me. But think about this. Let's say 11. All right, let's bump it up. Maybe you weren't 11 the first time you had sex, if you've had sex. Maybe 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 17. In either case, think about when you want to have kids. How many people in here would like to have kids someday? A lot of you. All right, how old do you want to be when you have a kid? 28. How old do you want to be? How old? 26. How old do you want to be? You don't know. Give me a ballpark. I won't hold you to it. 35. How about you? How old? 27. 27-ish? All right. The average is anyone even want to wait till they're 40 maybe? You'd be too old. Here's the problem though. I've said up here it's hard to be a teenager. If you are a hunter-gatherer, if you are living in the EEA, if you are living in the world in which there is no birth control, the average hunter-gatherer, they hook up with someone, they start having kids when they're about 12 or 13 or 14. That's the way it works. And so your instincts say, hey, suddenly my body feels like it's time to reproduce. And you do. But we're in a situation here where you're telling me that you become reproductively capable at 12 or 13 or 14, but you want to have a kid when you're 26 or 35 or 24 or something like that. There's a 10-year period here where there are real problems, right? Your body's sending you one message saying, reproduce, reproduce, reproduce. Your brain, the other part of you, is saying, don't reproduce, my parents will kill me, my career will be over, my life will be bad, don't reproduce. And so you've got this battle back and forth, where your instincts are telling you to do one thing, and society, culture, just these ideas, this has only changed since we have industrialized societies. The idea of, no, you should have a kid when you're in your 20s or even 30s. That is new. For that reason, everyone talks about, oh, it's so hard to have a teenager. Oh, teenagers are terrible. Well, why are they terrible? They're terrible because we've put them in an impossible position. Their body wants to do something, and now we've told them, you can't do that. It would be like if we made a rule that says, okay, from the years 13 to 25, you can't walk. You have to crawl on your knees. And because we know you could do it, but everything inside you is saying, well, that's not how it should be. And that would be a really difficult situation to be in. So if you're a teenager, or if you're just somewhere in between those years of when it's socially acceptable to start reproducing versus when it is biologically possible to reproduce, you've got a problem. So this is a downside possibly a downside of culture and technology. What else? We've talked about firearms. I asked how many of you had shot a gun, and almost all of you, it seemed, were off gun-toting and being a little crazy. Well, what's going on here? They reduce the need for strength. We are a sexually dimorphic species. Males, on average, are bigger than females, larger muscle mass, stronger. And for that reason, all sorts of things go on in terms of power control between males and females. Well, now we have guns. You can be the smallest female in town, and it doesn't matter. You can take down any guy. Because of that, that upsets the balance of the sexual dimorphism in some ways. There's an equalizer there in terms of biological constraints on what is possible or not possible in terms of controlling resources or just exerting your will. What else do we have? Military. Thousands of young men volunteer and women volunteer for military service. Usually they do because someone else has persuaded them that this would be a good idea. That's unusual. This does not have precedent in hunter-gatherer societies. But other people can fight your battles because of culture, because of ideas. You can say, we have this idea about liberty or about democracy or about freedom to choose what you want to do. And by propagating that idea to other people, they will fight for you so that you get that thing that you want. That's because of culture. What else do we have? This is an important one. Money. You don't have to have other people owe you favors that you can collect on when times get tough. This was true in the hunter-gatherer world. Money did not exist. Money is a relatively recent invention. But because of it, we talked a lot about this when we talked about reciprocal altruism, we have a currency now where you can do one favor, but you can redeem that favor for a completely different favor through the use of money. But this causes our instincts in terms of feeling a debt to one person or feeling that someone else owes you, because money allows these favors to be interconvertible. It is a component of culture. And because of that, suddenly we don't have to rely on others, and we don't have to specifically rely on the people that we did a favor for to return that favor. They can give us money. So you've got all of these different ways in which culture causes us to not be able to trust our instincts the way we once could. So I'll call this our first take-home message. The environment we live in, when I say we, I'm talking about us in Los Angeles, in an industrialized society. I don't mean all humans. Evolution fine-tuned us for a different world. We have instincts that are very strong and very good in a particular world. It's not the world we live in now. I don't want to give you the idea, though, that culture is all-powerful. It's become a cliche. Well, it's not nature, it's not nurture. There's some combination between the two. We talk about the norm of reaction, and that is certainly true. But let's look at this idea about culture being able to free us from our biology from the other side, because it's constrained by biology as well. There still is a tension between us, and when I say us, I mean the conscious part of your brain that says, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. In Mean Genes, we talk about it just as the self-control battles you fight. I want to weigh less than I do. I want to have more money than I do. I want to not do drugs that I've done. I want to have better relationships with my friends. All of these things, there can be battles going on where there's tensions between what your genes are nudging you to do and what you want to do. This, I would say, if there is any theme in this class or any theme of ideas in the world that I think about most, this is it. the idea that our genes really are nudging us this way or nudging us that way or nudging us the other way. And we then have culture on top of that that says, I can be aware of that and I can fight that, or I can fight that, or I can fight something else. But being aware of this tension, I think that awareness can be the most powerful thing that you can have in terms of getting to live life the way you want to. Let me talk about an example, a sort of less general but still experimentally pretty cool example of constrained learning. A study was done in rats. I couldn't find a picture of a rat, so I have to use my trusty mouse here. Here's what they did. They had some rats in cages, and they had them drink water certain times. If they drank out of a particular dish, they would blast some noises, and they would have the lights flash on and off. And then the way the cage was set up, they could give an electric shock to the animal. Sorry, I didn't do these studies. They are cruel, but what do you think happened to mice? Now, in the future, every time the noise and lights start going off, they stop drinking from that dish because they know if they keep drinking, they're going to get an electric shock. You can train them relatively easily. If I drink out of the dish that causes the noise and lights to go off, I'm going to get an electric shock. They did another set of manipulations where they had a couple of dishes, and one of them, they made it taste weird. They then zapped the cage with some x-rays, and so the animal can't see these, but through the x-rays, if you give them a high enough dosage, it'll make them nauseous. And they only did this when they drank out of the bowl that had the weird taste. What do you think happens here? They learn relatively quickly, the thing that tastes bad makes me sick. They stop drinking out of this. So you just train them. So there's nothing going on here that's super surprising. You could say this. You could say rats have, I call it a genetically coded hypothesis that says, if I feel sick, it must be something I ate. I think about this because when I was a little kid, my mom, who is an excellent cook, once cooked something called beef Wellington. And for some reason, I think I was just coming down with an illness or something. I got really horribly sick that night, throwing up, et cetera, et cetera. To this day, if I go somewhere and beef Wellington's on the menu, I start to feel nauseous. I don't want to order it. It's dumb, right? If I'm going to some fancy restaurant now and they have beef Wellington, it's not going to make me sick. But I have this hypothesis that my brain made. It's like, I felt sick after I ate that, and so I've associated the two. Well, the same researchers then did this. They switched one aspect of the study. They had some of the rats drink water out of a particular bowl. They had the noise and lights go off, and then they zapped them with x-rays. So, and then they get nauseous. Question being, did they learn, if I drink from the bowl where the noise and lights are caused to go off, then do I associate that with I got sick? They don't. No matter how often they do this, the rats cannot learn that when the noise and lights go off, they're going to get sick, and they drink from that bowl equally frequent to the other bowl that doesn't give that outcome. Similarly, they did this. In the other cages, they had the weird-tasting water, and every time the animal drank out of the weird-tasting bowl, what did they do? Zapped him with electric shock. Question being, if you consume water from the weird-tasting bowl, are you going to learn then to not do that because you get the electric shock? They couldn't learn it. No matter how often they did that, these rats never learned to avoid the weird-tasting water. This is referred to as the sauce béarnaise phenomenon because the guy who described it had a bad incident with béarnaise sauce, made him sick. To this day, he doesn't want to eat it because he has this hypothesis, certain things must be linked. In other words, our biology is very ready to do certain things. And they're things that have relevance to the real world. It makes sense. You can imagine situations where noise and lights are associated with electric shock or getting struck by lightning or something else. Or consuming something that tastes rotten does make you sick because it's infested with various microorganisms, something like that. But evolutionarily, these situations don't get coupled. So there was never any selection pressure to have the capacity to associate these or to associate these. So in that way, culture, or the ability to learn things, is limited. You can't just learn anything. Certain things can't be learned. So I've already answered this question here, but I want you to think about formally answering it, the question of why can we condition rats to learn some associations but not others? So the question is, are we biologically programmed? I hate using the word programmed because it implies complete inflexibility. In this case, yeah, it looks like our underlying biology doesn't allow us to make certain connections, whereas other connections, it allows us to make them very, very easily. So this would be our second take-home message. We just have 3 today. That prepared learning, I say, illuminates the leash of biology reigning in culture's ability to shape our behavior. In other words, culture can cause us to be differently. We can alter our behavior, but we don't have a blank slate. It's not like anything is possible. Lots of things are possible, but not everything. And so these studies of prepared learning, and there are lots of studies in the world, both with humans and with animals and non-human primates, showing that they can learn certain things really easily. Those tend to always be the things that have some element that is related to reproductive success and probably natural selection. The things that we tend not to be able to learn tend to be completely unrelated to reproductive success. Think about this in terms of, remember we talked about gossip early on when we were talking about reciprocal altruism, and I said you can have a hard time trying to learn biology facts, but it can be really, really easy to keep track of which romantic relationships are occurring in the world, or who is a big tipper, or who is a cheapskate. All those things. We can learn those easily because they have evolutionary value. We can't learn things that easily that don't. Question? So the question is there evidence that we are evolving? It would seem that I'm saying our environment is so unusual and alien that we're not evolving anymore. What does it take for evolution by natural selection to occur? It's got to be variation for a trait. It's got to be heritable. You knew I'd work this in again. And there has to be differential reproductive success based on it. As long as we have that, and we certainly can have that today, all of you have some mate preferences, right? And if we were to list those, and there were some commonalities to them, we could say, there still seems to be selection for increased height in males. On average, females tend to choose partners or desire in partners height. So you could say, all right, is evolution by natural selection occurring? Sure. Or people might choose partners who are able to amass lots of resources. Well, you amass resources today, not necessarily by being the biggest, strongest guy, but maybe being the smartest. And so if there is selection such that the smartest people, the smartest males or females are getting selected more often, then natural selection works. So you always have to think just in terms of, okay, it didn't work the way, our environment isn't the same as before, but natural selection as a process is just always going on as long as you've got those 3 things. So because the environment is different, the selective forces, they can be different. So for instance, there used to be really strong selection against people who had bad eyesight. So now you could say there is natural selection going on now that says if you have crappy eyes, you can be as successful as anyone else. So the selection has changed, that selective pressure has been reduced. But simultaneously, there has been selection for figuring out how to have access to health care, right? Because if you don't, then you can't fix the eyesight. But if you do, you can. So, All right, the last thing I put on our outline was culture breaks down the fundamental reproductive equation. So I want to talk more about how culture can free us from our biology. But do you know what the fundamental reproductive equation is? No? Okay, well, I'm going to teach you something of tremendous significance today. And in doing so, I want to talk about rubber. Here's what we know about the fundamental reproductive equation. We're going to look at rubber possibly as the pinnacle of human evolution. All right. Sex equals pregnancy. I can't believe you're writing this down. Please tell me you knew this before class. Right? That is just the way our biology works. What else do we know? I'll kill you if you write this one down. Pregnancy equals babies. I am going to get fired. No, there's a point. There will be a point, I promise. What do we know about babies? Babies equal maternal child care. Remember our hunter-gatherer gal? She's got 2 babies on her, carrying them around every day. What do we know about mammals? Internal gestation and lactation. That was a constraint, a reproductive constraint that said the male cannot provide those. Maternal child care, maybe this is less obvious than the other ones, can lead to loss of female economic opportunity. If you're taking care of your kid all day, it's hard to earn a lot of money. It's a very, very, very hard job, but nobody's paying you for it. Loss of female economic opportunity equals something as well. It equals loss of female political power. When you don't have money, you tend not to have a big say in the political process. And so we started with a biological instinct, something that our biology is pushing us into. Sex is good. We want to have sex. Something inside our body says, that was nice. I want to do it again if you have sex. And so we are built in such a way that that first step, we're constantly being nudged down that first step, but it ends badly, right? First pregnancy, then babies, then maternal child care, then loss of female economic opportunity, and then loss of female political power. It ends particularly badly for females. But this is where rubber comes in. Because we can think about maybe the most significant change in terms of biological constraints and being released from them through technology and culture from rubber. There's a process called vulcanization of rubber, and it's where you heat it up, you add some other chemicals to it, and allows you to shape it, mold it, do all sorts of things to it. And we know how to do this because some people figured it out and they told other people. And those other people told other people and they told other people. And now we can do almost anything we want with rubber. Why is that relevant to the fundamental reproductive equation? Because now sex does not have to equal pregnancy. We have an instinct to do something, and that instinct leads to a bad outcome. And because of culture, it doesn't have to. So we want to understand how natural selection works. We want to understand how culture works. But it's also interesting to see how the two interact to really do important and significant things to our world. So culture has allowed us to block out this first step. Has culture done anything here? Does pregnancy have to equal babies? No. we have methods of medically safe and reasonably accessible abortion. Perhaps not appealing, but a possibility, such that the instinct to sex, somehow, if it does lead to pregnancy, the pregnancy doesn't necessarily, in an industrialized society, does not necessarily have to lead to babies. But let's say it does. You got babies. Do babies have to lead to maternal child care? Think about rubber again, right? Males can't lactate, right? They can't get pregnant. However, what can they do? With rubber, bottles. Sorry, these are the pictures I have. I can make a bottle for Jack anytime. I carry them with me all the time. Rubber nipples. He sucks on them. He can get milk. And so having a baby does not have to equal maternal child care. Julia goes to work. I take care of Jack. This is significant. It's because of technology. Hunter-gatherers do not have males taking care of the children at early ages. The mother has to be there to feed them. So this is a significant way in which culture is breaking down the fundamental reproductive equation. What else do we have, though, here? Does maternal child care, let's say maternal child care, what else do we have? Here we have a daycare. We've got situations where if we don't have the ability to stop pregnancy, or we don't have the ability to stop pregnancy, turn it into babies, and we don't have the ability for babies not to be taken care of by the mother, we can set up situations where through daycare centers we can have individuals taking care of other people's babies. It's another idea that breaks this down. That one doesn't have anything to do with rubber. Hey, rubber works into two of them. That's pretty powerful in terms of breaking down the most important thing. It probably has something to do with it, but I don't know. Now, what about this? Loss of female economic opportunity. Like, has culture completely obliterated the fundamental reproductive equation? Does low economic opportunity translate into low political power? No rubber involved here, but this is something where culture is working on. What would you say is probably the most important cultural idea that breaks that down? What's that? Education is a good one. Democracy. The right to vote, I would say, is one that you don't necessarily see in all societies, and I'd hardly put a complete block through. Nonetheless, it is a situation where there are ideas that cause the breakdown of that particular link in this equation. So I'd still say it's a pretty significant barrier to women attaining positions of significant political influence, but it's real. So I'd say this. I'd say culture can free us from our biological constraints, and make equality. Let's see if I have better pictures. No. Make equality possible. Every one of those steps is not perfect, though. And that should cause you to keep in mind this idea that you've got instincts and they're pushing you down roads that have predictable outcomes. But now this idea that culture interplays with it makes it a little bit harder to predict how things are going to turn out. Now, one last question I want you to ponder between now and next time is this. There are lots and lots of people in the world who are fighting the breakdown of the fundamental reproductive equation. What's going on with that? Why do you think there might be people who decide, I'm going to figure out ways in which I can reduce the extent to which that equation gets broken down? Think from an evolutionary perspective. All right, I'm going to stop here for the day. I will see you on Thursday. Sadly, Thursday is our last day together.